In 1934, Germany unveiled what was supposed to be the perfect machine gun. The MG-34 was the most advanced weapon of its kind in the world, a revolutionary design that could do everything. Light enough for infantry to carry, powerful enough to mount on tanks, precise enough for anti-aircraft work. It was a masterpiece of German engineering, but by 1942 that same masterpiece had become Germany's biggest production nightmare, and the desperate attempt to fix its flaws would accidentally create the most feared machine gun in military history, the MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw. What most people don't know is that the MG-42 wasn't designed to be better. It was designed to be cheaper. And the story of how Germany's obsession with perfection nearly cost them the war, only to be saved by embracing imperfection, reveals something fascinating about the nature of innovation under pressure. We're going to walk through the full story, how the MG-34's fatal flaws were built into it from day one, why those flaws didn't matter until suddenly they did, and how a small team of engineers created a weapon that would outlast the Reich itself and still be in service 80 years later. After World War I, German military planners had a problem. The Treaty of Versailles banned them from developing new weapons, but behind the scenes, they were already thinking about the next war, and they wanted something revolutionary. A single machine gun that could replace every other automatic weapon in their arsenal. Think about what that meant. Other countries like the United States used different guns for different jobs. The M2 Browning for heavy firepower, the M1919 for medium support, the BAR for individual soldiers. Each weapon had its role, and each required its own supply chain, training program, and maintenance system. The Germans wanted one gun to do it all. By 1934, they had it. The MG-34 was unlike anything the world had seen. It fired 900 rounds per minute from a belt-fed system. It had a quick-change barrel that could be swapped in seconds when it overheated. It could be fired from a bipod by infantry, mounted on the Lafette tripod for long-range precision work, installed in tanks and aircraft, or used as an anti-aircraft gun with specialized sights. And here's what made it truly revolutionary. It was the first general-purpose machine gun. That concept, the GPMG, would go on to define how every modern army thinks about automatic weapons. The MG-34 invented that. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems, and they were all baked into the design from the very beginning. The MG-34 was a luxury weapon. Every part was precision machined from high-quality steel. The tolerances were incredibly tight, which made it accurate and reliable when properly maintained. But those same tight tolerances made it expensive and slow to produce. It took approximately 150 man-hours to build a single MG-34. That's nearly 4 full weeks of skilled labor for one gun. The cost was around 320 Reichsmarks per unit, about $3,000 in today's money. And it required 108 pounds of raw materials, much of it high-grade steel that needed to be milled and machined with precision. In peacetime, this wasn't a problem. Germany had skilled workers, well-equipped factories, and time. By 1939, when war broke out, they had already produced around 50,000 MG-34's. That gave them a massive advantage at the start of the conflict. But war changes everything, because the MG-34 had another flaw that wouldn't reveal itself until soldiers started using it in the field. Those tight manufacturing tolerances that made it so precise also made it sensitive to dirt, mud, sand, and extreme temperatures. On the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees, the MG-34 would freeze. In North Africa, sand got into the mechanism and caused jams. In the mud of the Russian steppes, the gun would seize up entirely. German soldiers learned to clean and oil their MG-34's religiously, because if they didn't, the weapon would fail at the worst possible moment. But the real crisis came from production. As the war expanded across Europe, North Africa, and into the Soviet Union, Germany needed machine guns by the tens of thousands. New divisions were being formed. Losses on the battlefield had to be replaced. Tanks, aircraft, and fortifications all needed MG-34's, and the factories couldn't keep up. Remember, each gun took 150 hours to build. The factories producing them were already committed to other war production. Skilled machinists were in short supply. Many had been drafted into the military. The precision tooling required to mill MG-34 parts was expensive and couldn't be easily replicated. By 1941, German commanders were facing a nightmare scenario. They had designed their entire infantry doctrine around the machine gun. Every squad was built around the MG-34 with riflemen supporting the gun team, but there weren't enough guns to equip all the squads. The mathematics were brutal. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. They needed to produce thousands of machine guns per month just to keep pace with losses and expansion. But the MG-34's complex design made that impossible. And here's the thing that really stung. The MG-34 was never designed for mass wartime production. It was designed to be the best. And in 1934, when the design was finalized, no one imagined Germany would be fighting a multi-front war against the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, Britain, and eventually the United States. The weapon that was supposed to give Germany an advantage was now holding them back. The search for a replacement had started even before the war. As early as 1937, German military officials were already looking for alternatives. They knew the MG-34 was too expensive and too slow to produce at scale. But finding a solution wasn't simple. The MG-34 worked. It was effective. Soldiers trusted it. Any replacement would have to match its performance while being cheaper and faster to manufacture. That's a tall order. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A small engineering firm called Grossfuss Metal und Lackierwarenfabrik. They weren't a major arms manufacturer. They made metal goods and lacquered products. But they had expertise in something the big arms companies didn't: stamped steel production. Stamping is a manufacturing process where sheets of metal are pressed into shape using dies. It's much faster than machining, requires less skilled labor, and wastes less material. It's how you mass-produce things like car body panels or metal furniture. Werner Gruner, an engineer at Grossfuss, proposed a radical idea. What if you could build a machine gun almost entirely from stamped parts? The military was skeptical. Stamped parts were seen as cheap, inferior. Machine guns were precision instruments. How could you possibly make one from pressed sheet metal? But Gruner's team went to work anyway. They studied the MG-34, identified which features were essential and which were over-engineered. They looked at where the MG-34 failed in the field and designed solutions. And most importantly, they figured out how to use stamping, welding, and simple pins to create a weapon that could be assembled quickly without precision machining. By 1942, they had a prototype. It was designated the MG-42, and when the military tested it, they realized something remarkable. This cheap stamped steel weapon wasn't just easier to produce. In some ways, it was actually better than the MG-34. The MG-42 cut production time in half. It took only 75 man-hours to build compared to 150 for the MG-34. It used just 61 pounds of raw materials instead of 108. And because it relied on stamping rather than machining, it could be produced in factories that weren't set up for precision weapons manufacturing. But the real surprise was the performance. The MG-42 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, a 30% increase over the MG-34. That rate of fire was so high that individual shots blended into a continuous roar. Allied soldiers who faced it described the sound as ripping canvas or a chainsaw. They called it Hitler's buzzsaw, and the psychological impact was devastating. The barrel change system was even faster than the MG-34's. Instead of unlatching and twisting from behind, the MG-42's barrel could be removed from the side with a single motion. A well-trained crew could swap barrels in 3 to 4 seconds and keep firing. And here's the part that really mattered for the battlefield. The MG-42 was more reliable in harsh conditions. The looser tolerances that came from stamped construction meant dirt and mud were less likely to jam the mechanism. It was easier to clean, easier to maintain, and more forgiving when soldiers couldn't give it the meticulous care the MG-34 demanded. The MG-42 wasn't designed to be a better weapon. It was designed to be a cheaper weapon. But in solving the production problem, the engineers had accidentally created something superior. You might think that once the MG-42 entered service, the MG-34 would be phased out immediately, but that's not what happened. Both guns remained in production until the end of the war. Why? First, retooling factories that were already producing MG-34's would mean stopping production entirely for weeks or months. Germany couldn't afford that gap. They needed guns now, not after a factory conversion. Second, the MG-34 was still the only option for certain roles. Remember how the barrel change systems were different? The MG-42's side-opening mechanism required space around the gun. Inside the cramped turret of a tank, that space didn't exist. The MG-34's rear extraction barrel change worked perfectly in tight spaces. So the MG-34 remained the standard coaxial and hull machine gun for German tanks throughout the war. The MG-42 was used externally, mounted on the commander's cupola for anti-aircraft and anti-infantry defense. By the end of the war, Germany had produced over 400,000 MG-42s and nearly 600,000 MG-34's. Both weapons served side by side and both earned fearsome reputations among Allied troops. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. The war ended, the Third Reich collapsed, but the MG-42 didn't die with it. When West Germany rearmed in the 1950s and joined NATO, they needed a new general-purpose machine gun. They looked at British and American designs and concluded that nothing matched what they'd already had. So they took their old MG-42s, rechambered them for the NATO standard 7.62 by 51 millimeter cartridge, and designated it the MG-1. A few years later, they made minor improvements and called it the MG-3. That weapon is still in service today with over 30 countries. The German Bundeswehr still uses it. So does the Pakistani military, the Turkish military, and dozens of others. Think about that. A weapon designed in 1942 as a desperate cost-cutting measure is still in frontline service 80 years later. The MG-3 has been used in every major conflict from the Cold War to Afghanistan to Ukraine. The MG-34, the perfect weapon, was retired and became a museum piece. The MG-42, the cheap replacement, became one of the most successful machine gun designs in history. But the story of the MG-34 and MG-42 isn't just about guns. It's about what happens when perfection meets reality. The MG-34 was designed by engineers who wanted to create the ultimate weapon, and they succeeded. It was brilliant, versatile, and effective, but they designed it in peacetime, with peacetime assumptions about production capacity, skilled labor, and time. When war came, those assumptions collapsed. Perfection became a liability. The very features that made the MG-34 excellent, precision machining, tight tolerances, high-quality materials, made it impossible to produce at the scale the war demanded. The MG-42 was designed by engineers who were given a different problem: make it cheaper and faster. They weren't trying to create the perfect weapon. They were trying to create a good enough weapon that could actually be built in the quantities needed. And in solving that practical problem, they accidentally created something better. The looser tolerances made it more reliable. The stamped construction made it lighter. The simplified design made it easier to maintain. The higher rate of fire made it more effective. None of these improvements were the goal. They were side effects of designing for mass production. This pattern shows up throughout history. The Sherman tank wasn't as good as the German Panther, but America could build 50,000 Shermans while Germany struggled to build 6,000 Panthers. The AK-47 isn't as accurate as the M16, but it works in mud, sand, and ice without cleaning, which is why it's the most widely used rifle in the world. Sometimes the best solution isn't the perfect solution. Sometimes it's the solution you can actually implement at scale. But there's one more twist to this story that's worth mentioning. After World War II, American weapons designers studied captured MG-42s extensively. They tried to reverse engineer it in a project called the T-24. They built prototypes, rechambered for the American 30-006 cartridge. And they failed. They couldn't get it to work reliably. They couldn't match the rate of fire. The project was abandoned. But elements of the MG-42's design, the stamped construction, the quick change barrel, the belt feed system, influenced the development of the M60 machine gun, which became the U.S. military's standard GPMG for decades. So even America, with all its industrial might and engineering expertise, couldn't simply copy the MG-42. But they learned from it, and that influence spread to machine gun designs around the world. The MG-34's flaws didn't just create the MG-42. They created a revolution in how machine guns were designed, manufactured, and deployed. The concept of the general-purpose machine gun pioneered by the MG-34 and perfected by the MG-42 became the standard for every modern military. Today, when you see a soldier carrying a belt-fed machine gun with a quick-change barrel, whether it's an M240, a FN MAG, or a PKM, you're looking at the descendants of that desperate wartime innovation. The MG-34 was supposed to be perfect. Its flaws forced Germany to create something better, and that cheap replacement changed warfare forever. Sometimes the best innovations come not from trying to build the perfect solution, but from trying to solve an immediate practical problem. The MG-34 taught us what was possible. The MG-42 taught us what was necessary. And 80 years later, we're still learning from both.